Well, welcome to another edition of the series called Answers. In this series called Answers, my goal is to help you by sharing with you short biblical answers to questions that people have been asking me. Today's question is, who can serve the Lord's Supper? Who can serve the Lord's Supper? And to answer this question, we have to look at how the Lord's Supper was first introduced and then also how the early church celebrated it. So let's look at the institution of the Lord's Supper. That's in Luke chapter 22, verses 7 to 15. Then came the day of unleavened bread, in which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare it?" they asked. Then he replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room that I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upper room, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover, and when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." So this passage makes it really clear. When Jesus first introduced the Lord's Supper, he was celebrating the Passover meal when he did it. In verse 11 that we looked at, Jesus said that he was preparing to eat the Passover meal with his disciples, and verse 15 here confirms that he did indeed celebrate the Passover meal when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. Okay, so the Lord's Supper was instituted out of the Passover meal. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 7 says, "For Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed." See, just shortly after Jesus instituted the Passover or the Lord's Supper, during the Passover meal or as part of the Passover meal, Jesus fulfilled the Passover by becoming the one-time eternal Passover lamb for us. But at the same time, he gave new meaning to the bread and the wine that he wanted us to continue to receive even as Gentile Christians for the years and even centuries to come. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 to 26 says, "And when Jesus had given thanks, he broke the bread and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" So Jesus is saying, this is not the last time you're going to do this. You're going to continue to do this in remembrance of me. Verse 25, "In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Okay, so Jesus wanted us to continue to observe the celebration of the Lord's Supper using the bread and wine really until he comes again. Okay, so how was the Passover meal served? Okay, how was it actually served? We need to look at the Passover meal there on your screen. Exodus chapter 12, verse 3. "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month," the first month of the Jewish calendar, "each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household." So the Passover meal was a celebration to be observed in every household, not just in the temple, but in every household on the 10th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar. No priest was required to come to the house. Instead, the spiritual head of each household was told to serve the Passover meal to his family. Now, when Jesus served the Passover meal to his disciples, it was very appropriate for him to be the one serving them, even though he was not of the same family of them, because he had become the spiritual head of those disciples. In essence, he'd become the spiritual father of the disciples. So today, if we want to celebrate the Lord's Supper in our house, it is very appropriate for the head of the household to serve the Lord's Supper. However, if we're the only Christian in the home, as it is in many cases, then we should, as the spiritual head of the household, we should be able to serve the Lord's Supper to ourselves, or even invite another Christian friend or a couple into our home and to celebrate it together. Now, what about the early church's observance of the Passover or of the Lord's Supper? Okay, how did they celebrate or observe the Lord's Supper? Well, Acts chapter 2, verses 43 to 47 says that the early disciples devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers worked together and had everything in common, selling their possessions and goods. They gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. As Jewish Christians, they still had the right to meet in the temple courts, not the Gentiles. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And each day they continued to meet together in the temple courts, and they broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. Notice that verse 46, they broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. So this passage describes the habits of the early church just days and weeks after the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit was poured out on them. And what does it say in verse 46? It says they broke bread in their homes and they ate together. The breaking of bread was part of the meal in the home, but it was not the same as the meal. It says they broke bread in their homes and they ate together. The breaking of bread was another way of saying that they were celebrating the Lord's Supper. We can see this in the Gospel of Luke again. It says in Luke chapter 22, verse 19, and Jesus took bread and he gave thanks and broke it. So from that point on, breaking of bread became known as part of celebrating the Lord's Supper. He took bread and gave thanks and he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So the phrase breaking of bread became synonymous with celebrating the Lord's Supper. And as we can see, it was done in the homes. Obviously, there was no priest present because no Jewish priest would preside over the Lord's Supper, and there was no need for a local church pastor to be present either. It was the spiritual head of the household who could celebrate or to present the Lord's Supper. So again, the Lord's Supper was celebrated in every Christian home, most likely by the spiritual head of the household. So one last thing. We call it the Lord's Supper. It is not the supper of a priest. It is not the supper of a local church. It is not the supper of a specific pastor or a church denomination. It is the Lord's Supper. Jesus himself, the Lord, instituted it, and he invited us to celebrate it. So if the Lord himself invited us to celebrate his supper, then no one else has the right to tell us we can't eat it whenever we want to, okay? No one has the right to stop us from celebrating, observing, or eating the Lord's Supper. It is called the Lord's Supper. It is called the Lord's table, and it is the Lord's invitation to come to his table and eat from the Lord's Supper. So let's freely celebrate the Lord's Supper in our homes and receive all of the grace that's available through the Lord's Supper by faith. God bless you.